Lord Seventh, is a priest novel. This is an audiobook made by fans for other fans. Disclaimer. The main couple of the story is made up of two men. If you don't like it, don't listen. Thank you. Remember, subscribe and click the bell to stay updated on all the new releases. Enjoy. Chapter 16. A Beauty Under the Moonlight. Jing-Chi subconsciously withdrew a half step away. I've troubled your highness with the worry. I've already gotten better. You sure did that quickly. Helian Yi huffed coldly. Maybe the crowd was too noisy, or maybe the little bit of wine he drank had gone to his head, but the young heir apparent abruptly felt like something was stuffing up his chest, his brows slowly creasing. Thinking that this was quite some overreaction over such a tiny matter, he could only swallow down the arising mysterious, stifling unhappiness that was getting stronger and stronger, thus looking at Jing-Chi like he was nice to see. Jing-Chi had long become exactly like a roundworm in the man's stomach, so once he saw that expression, he knew he wasn't joking around. The crown prince was legitimately angry. He thereupon shifted his eyes to the side, pulled Wuxia over from there to divert the subject, and smiled. Take a look, your highness. Do you know who this is? Helian Yi stared blankly for a bit. The youth looked unfamiliar. After scrutinizing him carefully, he could tell that the other's facial features had subtle areas of difference to that of a central plainsman's, and on top of that, he noticed Ashenli was standing behind him. Needless to say, he knew that this was the Nanjiang Shamanette. He looked at him with slight astonishment, thinking that the shamanette's face was actually a bit juvenile, which made it seem like he was a bit younger than his true age. Wuxia hadn't expected him to suddenly crop up, nor was he willing to speak more with him. After bowing, he stood quietly by Jing-Chi's side, and the two appeared to be exceptionally close at a glance. Helian Yi recalled that Jing-Chi had just been looking relaxed, eyes hooded as he pointed things out at random all over the place. Yet, upon seeing him, his eyes had then started to shift about every which way, as if he was plotting how to disappear from his view. He was all the more discontent on the inside, face unwittingly getting somewhat sullen. Jing-Chi was somewhat bewildered as to why he was so severely angry today. Upon raising his head, he happened to notice a plain-clothed young man following not too far behind Helian Yi, and thus quickly found another escape route. Oi, I don't recognize that brother. Is he with you, Crown Prince? Only then did Helian Yi remember that he had forgotten the one behind him, so he quickly turned around and beckoned him over. Come here, Zishu, and greet the junior prince of the Prince Nanning estate and the Nanjiang Shamanette. He then said to the pair, this is a Jianghu friend I had the coincidental chance to meet. You two can get a lot closer to him after you get acquainted. Jing-Chi nearly couldn't keep the smile on his face. Zishu? This guy was Zhou Zishu. The young man stepped forward. Both Wuxia and Ashenli were startled, thinking that the guy seemed to have appeared out of thin air. Had Jing-Chi not pointed him out, they wouldn't have detected him at all. Also, Wuxia wasn't sure if the other was born this way or if it was done on purpose, but he felt that the youth's face was even less distinctive than indistinctiveness itself, and anyone who saw him would forget him once they turned around. This man was clearly standing right under everyone's noses, yet he could make them all overlook him, with even the recently enraged Helian Yi having narrowly forgotten his existence. Wuxia turned to peer at Jing-Chi with some skepticism, wondering, how did he find him out? Yet it was Zhou Zishu who was even more shocked on the inside. His special talent was making people turn a blind eye to him, and this was the first time since he was born that someone had pointed him out in public. Who was Zhou Zishu? The most mysterious group of people that the great Qing's royal family had held in their grasp was called Heaven's Pain. Regardless of whether one was an aristocratic upper class or a working lower class, as long as the Son of Heaven gave the order, the feelers of Heaven's Pain could stretch to nearly any place in the world. It was founded with a lifetime of effort from Helian Yi, and its first leader was precisely Zhou Zishu. He was a master of the technique of changing appearances, and no one knew how many faces he actually had alone, such an all-permeating, venerable yet terrifying person. During his previous lifetime, Jing Qi and this young master Zhou shared the same bad habits, and they were practically close friends from their first meeting. One out in the open and one in the dark, they directly caused the total collapse of Helian Zhao and Qi's two parties. However, when Helian Yi ultimately wanted him dead, his 10 atrocities were also Zhou Zishu's masterpieces. It wasn't that he disregarded friendship, he had even intentionally taken advantage of the dead of night to slip by himself into the prince's estate to warn him. What a shame that Jing Qi had mentally been in a firm knot and didn't listen to a single word. What had he said to him at the time? Something like, "If there's a next life, I'll drink with you until we've had our fill, and we won't go home until we're drunk." Zhou Zishu had sighed that day, sweeping his sleeves out and leaving. The following day in court, Prince Nanning's 10 atrocities were put on clear display, every sentence and word smashing into him, drenching him with blood. All that could be said was that, from head to tail, Zhou Zishu was a clear-headed man that knew who his master was. He couldn't be said to be unfeeling, he was simply aware of what kind of world this was, and what he ought to do in it. Of course, none of these sentimental moods from switching lifetimes were the main point right now. The main point was, Zhou Zishu's face was not one he had used often, and in addition to hundreds of years elapsing, Jing Qi hadn't recognized him for a moment. It was simply that, in his previous life, he had grown accustomed to seeing him standing behind Helian Yi like a shadow, so he discovered that there was another person there on intuition. However, in light of common logic, his skill would be limited only to fancy but useless arts, as he was a dandy teen who stayed at home all day and never went anywhere. He shouldn't have insight to the degree where he could notice Zhou Zishu. As expected, the gaze Zhou Zishu surveyed him with was a bit scanning. This commoner greets the prince and Chaminette. Jing Qi quickly pulled out a smile. How fortunate, how fortunate. This prince has always been hoping to walk Jianghu, drifting along as a big hero and whatnot. You'll have to talk about it a lot, brother Zhou. Helian Yi smiled. Even if you walk Jianghu, you wouldn't be a big hero. Can you do anything other than swindle people? Frowning, Jing Qi thought for half the day about this, really racking his brains. Eat, drink, wench, and gamble. He got slapped on the forehead by Helian Yi, the noise resounding loudly. Feeling that his own hit had been heavy-handed coming down, Helian Yi used his fingers to massage the spot for him. Wuxia stood a bit awkwardly to the side, thinking of how those two were constantly so friendly, yet he was forever an outsider. He consequently turned his head to look at the huge pleasure boat in the center of the river. Jing Qi quickly changed the subject in order to avoid this excessively intimate action of Helian Yi's. Right, I haven't been out for years. What's Miss Moon doing here? Miss Moon is the annually chosen highest-rated woman in the capital. Sometimes she's a famed courtesan, and sometimes she's a famed actress. Last year, the highest-rated was Mist Form's Miss Heiyu. No one yet knows who it's landed on this year, Zhou Zishu explained while smiling. Coincidentally, this commoner has a small boat acquired over there. If you noblemen don't resent the notion, using it to take a closer look is appealingly refined and romantic. Jing only opened his mouth to ask, "Is there alcohol?" Of course there is. Ch16 had no other shortcomings than solely being fond of the stuff inside cups, so, once he heard this, his eyes brightened immediately. "I'm not sure which kind you want, Prince." Jing grinned. "As it happens, winter is warm this year. The river has no ice on it, the lake shines in the moonlight, and there's a jade-like beauty to appreciate. This all would best be paired with aged daughter red. Do you have any?" Suddenly realizing that he had found a comrade among drunkards, Ch16 laughed heartily. "One that's 30 years old." "Your Highness, Prince, chaminette this way, please." This world was one of old companions being like new acquaintances, and freshly met people being like old friends. "My good friend, I made an appointment with you in the last life to not go home until we were drunk. You don't remember it now, but I've come to follow it up." Wuxia stared at Jing in a daze, watching as he talked and laughed without scruples, and suddenly sensed that the teen had a subtle feeling of disharmony about him. When seen from the front, he was an elegant youth, but from the back, he carried the flavor of being down and out from the hurdles of life due to his casual, crude hemp clothes. It was like he had been continuously walking on the road like this, merely asking for a cup of raw wine to warm the stomach between the people coming and going, and as if he was constantly awaiting or holding fast in such a lone-walking fashion, others wanted to catch up, but they would always feel that they were separated by a distance of infinite landscape. He didn't know where he had apparently seen such a back-view figure before. His mind wandered, but he couldn't remember it. Then, upon a closer look, Prince Nanning was still the junior prince that couldn't distinguish between the 5 basic crops, wouldn't make his own limbs move, and had changed out of his finery to mingle with the common folk, while he himself was simply following 3.5 steps behind him. Ch16 was born of an influential Jianghu family and had some inheritance, so the so-called small boat was naturally, not that small. On it was a full variety of fine wine and good food, and the most wonderful thing was the spot it was docked in, as the full moon ship that Miss Moon would be performing on was extremely close. Last year, this position was reportedly sold for over 1,000 taels of silver. After the cups of their few people were filled with wine, movement came from the full moon ship. The one who was just playing the flute was an old man in black clothes, who stood at a respectful distance near the ship's railing. The old monk was in an equivalent of meditation, eyes observing with his nose and mouth shut. At this moment, he somehow received some kind of signal, as he suddenly lifted the flute and placed it against his lips. On the other side, a Chin child had already set up the Chin stand, and a young man sat down, shut his eyes, and put both of his hands atop the Chin. These two are master musicians that the Color Jade Troop's leader paid hefty gold to dig up, Ch16 explained. They don't come out to display their arts easily. The Chin master was seen to open his eyes all of a sudden, lifting his hand to pluck out a note. The flute's sound gradually rose up in tandem, their airy music brushing across the surface of the water, then spiraling upwards. Every single person on and around the river quieted, not a sound made in the ambience. Quickly after, a clear female voice split through the air, as if it was going to tear open the night's darkness. A plain-clothed woman slowly opened the curtain, her singing rippling out from the packed 30-liss of the full moon river, with the Chin chasing after it. All the excitement came to a halt for the sound as it ascended up, held, whirled around, then concluded. Its trailing note persisted, gossamersk and lingering on without end, combined with the shivering flute, it was akin to a sigh in one's mind. This was just like the capital markets were lined with precious goods, households were filled with luxurious fabrics, and 100,000 assorted people were present. Was this scene divine? Where had this melody come from? The woman's gaze swept out, 10,000 lit lamps all dimming down, and she bowed, lightly smiling with a restrained expression. Helian Yi felt like he had been viciously stabbed in the heart, watching her stupidly for a moment, then thinking that her appearance was, sort of familiar. Could she be, an old love from a previous life? Ch16 heard his full-on emotional sigh and shook his head, bowing it to down the rest of the wine bowl. Wuxia felt some sort of emotion, lowering his own head in unknown thought, while Jing was blank. He could forget anyone's face, except for that woman's. Qingluan. Su. Qingluan. For a moment, he seemed to perceive all sorts of pains: the pain of being crushed, the pain of having his flesh and bones cut up into tiny pieces, the pain of being skinned. The moisture of Full Moon River gave off a frigid, harsh aura, gradually coating his entire body. Every con of his bones and blood was frozen stiff, cold wind swiftly blowing past, he jolted, becoming clear-headed. This was old Jianghu, after all. He snapped out of it, some mixture of feelings within him. He couldn't say what taste they had, but they had all lost color due to old age, and before he could get their flavors, they dissipated into nothing. Thankfully, Ch16 and Helian Yi were both watching Miss Moon's Qingluan on stage, not paying attention to him. Wuxia, however, gently raised a hand to hold his arm. "What's wrong with you?" he asked quietly. "Why did you shake just now? Are you cold?" With that, he pulled the other two's attention back. Helian Yi acknowledged that he had forgotten himself somewhat, coughing lightly. "What, are you freezing?" Jing smiled. "I actually am a bit cold." Ch16 hurriedly called for them to pull ashore, then brought a big cloak over and draped it over him. "It was my carelessness. I forgot that you gents don't have rough skin that's undergone toughening up like us Jianghu folk do. Is there anything urgent, Prince?" Jing waved his hand, indicating that he wasn't hindered. "I'm not that delicate, I just can't deal with wind once I've had wine. The day's gotten late, so do forgive me for making myself scarce." "Wuxia, are you staying with them, or?" Wuxia was green to begin with, and, despite his youth, he wasn't super playful, so he could automatically bring everything to a halt at the appropriate time. Moreover, he wasn't familiar with the other two, and couldn't talk that well, either. "I'll go back with you." Helian Yi hesitated, thinking of what to say, but Jing turned his head and gave him a really obscene smile. "No need to worry about me, Crown Prince. This is a good night that's painfully brief, so cherish it well." Saying so, he dragged Wuxia away. Those alleged skin-cutting pains were all matters of the past. Helian Yi frowned, but his attention promptly shifted back to this year's new Miss Moon. There were people that didn't believe in fate, but for some, they were possibly innately destined to miss it. Perhaps they lacked a little pre-affinity, or a little luck, who knew? Wuxia quietly followed behind Jing. After getting familiar with him, the latter was regularly quite engaging. It was difficult to imagine that a pampered rich boy that muddled through life and never went out his door could be so knowledgeable. Wuxia generally played the listener role, silently noting things down in his mind when he came across an area of interest, not yet wanting to look into them. As he was walking without talking like so, Wuxia knew that he was tired. The benefit to being with Wuxia was that he never needed to worry about his own rudeness, because the other teen would always do even ruder stuff. Without those superficially civil restrictions of society, this instead seemed rather natural. If he wanted to talk and laugh, then he would talk and laugh, and if he wanted to be lost in thought, then he would be lost in thought. Wuxia was aware that he didn't understand a lot of things himself, so he never blabbed about other people's affairs. All of a sudden, he pulled at Jing-Chi, abruptly tugging him behind him. When Jing-Chi dizzily came to his senses, he saw that in the place he was just standing at, there was an arrow stuck in the ground that glinted with a bit of blue light. End of the chapter. Stay tuned for more BL.